Hello, welcome back to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood, and joining me as my co host for this season, Shannon Hopkins. Hey, Shannon.
Hey, Lisa.
Our theme for this season is Facing Reality, Claiming Leadership. And we have invited leaders to help us paint a robust picture of our current reality by sharing with us their perspective from the work that they are actively engaged in. So, we've talked about everything from ambiguous loss and the myth of closure to the challenges universities are facing today and the accelerating age and what it means for the church and so much more. And more is yet to come. So keep tuning in. So the point is, as different as these leaders and conversations have been, each of our guests has named as part of the reality they are facing in their context, as part of the reality we are facing as a country and even as a church, is polarization. Our guest today, James Talarico, says it more plainly than others, perhaps. He says that polarization is the challenge of our time. And as a state representative, in many ways, his every day is dealing with and navigating the polarization that has come to dominate so much of the politics in our country. And of course, polarization has become significant in our churches too. We will talk about that with James, who some have said is an aspiring preacher because he is still actively enrolled in seminary at Austin Presbyterian Seminary and not yet a graduate or an ordinand. But as you will pick up on, he articulates his faith beautifully and profoundly. And you will likely agree with us that we can remove the aspiring adjective and just call him a preacher. We recognize that in this era of polarization, even having an elected politician on our podcast is a bit of a risk. We know we will not all agree with everything James says. And we know that's true of all our guests, actually. So we're grateful for the ways that you, our listeners, reach out to us to share your thoughts. And we are committed to listening and responding in ways that are open minded and life giving, because ultimately, this is all about relationship. The way forward through polarization, as James articulates and demonstrates, is never losing sight of the fact that we are each beloved children of God. So, with that, Shannon, what stood out to you in our conversation with James?
Oh my gosh, Lisa, so much stood out. This was a richer conversation than I could have imagined. Um, a few of the things, the way he taught about to be like Christ is to love neighbor, and neighbor specifically the person who might be labeled other and different from you. uh, and then how he's enacting that in his daily life as he navigates the spaces in and between church and faith. And then the way he talks about friendship and his friendship agenda. And, that really encouraged and spoke to me when he talked about how we really take for granted, like the depth of friendship and allyship and how we need to talk about that more. And I know already, um, there's been a whole season about friendship, but I love the way he
Right?
brought a new way of thinking about it too.
Yeah. And connected it so deeply to this understanding that, whether you're talking about your neighbor or you're talking about a friend, you're not just talking about the folks that agree with
That's
you
right.
and that you spend time with all the time, but in the deepest sense of the gospel call, it's the person who, as you've said, is you might label other or who is
Mm.
different or doesn't always agree. And um, yeah,
I think,
that feels so.
yeah, deep, rich, right? And then
Yes, right.
deep. And I think that's the other thing that really struck out. Um, the other thing that really stood out for me is how deeply guided by his faith he is,
Yes,
and also just how deeply rooted and formed he is. This isn't just he started going to seminary. It's,
right.
the way he reaches back and talks about his grandparents and, how
Yeah.
he was raised, but also his ongoing continual formation. I thought there was just so much. I felt like we could have talked to him for hours.
Yeah, and didn't you feel a bit like we'd gone to church?
Yes,
In the best way that I mean that, right?
in the
Right. Yeah.
very best way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's listen to our conversation with James. James, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We are so excited. We've really been looking forward to having this conversation with you. And this season is all about exploring the theme of facing reality and claiming leadership. And we've had conversations with leaders from various sectors of society, if you will, to share their perspective with us. So think in terms of preachers and university presidents and executive directors and authors and theologians and such. And in some ways, they are all politicians, but really, you are the very first elected politician that we've had with us,
Wow.
and so we thought. So we thought of you because of an article written about you by Adam Wren in June of 23, and we'll link it in our show notes. But the article highlights your faith, and and the first few words he used to describe you, he said. He described you as the representative and aspiring preacher. And so we want to start really with your story and how did you come to be a representative and an aspiring preacher?
Well, thanks again for having me on here, and it's really an honor to be joining y'all and having this conversation. My granddad was a Baptist preacher in South Texas, and I still attend the same church that I was baptized in when I was 2 years old. It happens to be a
Oh, cool.
Presbyterian church here in Round Rock, Texas, just north of Austin. And now I'm a seminary student studying to become a minister myself. So my faith is the most important thing to me, and it's what underpins all the work I do, whether as a public school teacher in San Antonio ISD, a nonprofit leader here in Central Texas, or as a member of the Texas House. Everything comes back to my faith and the call to love God and love neighbor. And my granddad used to tell me that we follow a barefoot rabbi who gave those two simple commandments to love God and love neighbor. And in many ways, being a seminary student and being a politician are just two ways that I'm able to fulfill that call. We have
Mhm.
to have both, right? It's really hard in our modern political system to love thy neighbor as
Yeah.
thyself. Um, and when you do, it can become exhausting and it's hard to sustain. And that's why I think we have that first commandment to love God, to love the the mystery that all of our neighbors are expressions of. And so going to seminary and working here in the capital are just the two ways that I try to follow those two simple commandments in my own life. And it's not easy. It's a balance between the two, but you need both, in my experience, to follow Jesus Christ in the way that we're called to do.
Oh. It's beautiful to hear you speak that way and to know that you are serving your community in the ways that you are and coming out of that place of deep faith. It's beautiful and inspiring and there's so much that you have just said in those few words that I hope that we get a chance to pull on. And one of those is, I mean, just the reality of what you just said, like, you're still taking classes, in seminary and you're in the legislature, like, you're balancing so many things. So first of all, thank you for saying yes to being with us. We're very excited about that. Um, but I'm curious if there's anything lately that you're learning in seminary. Clearly you were formed in the faith and that formation is guiding you and leading you in everything that you're doing. And but I'm curious if you're learning anything in the classroom in seminary that's impacting your work as a representative.
So many things. The article that you mentioned by
Hmm.
Adam Wren had a great description. He followed me around for a typical day as a seminary student and as a legislator. And in that article, he wrote that I was literally navigating the space between church and state as I drove the 7 minutes from the seminary to the state capitol, and so it's really a fascinating push and pull between these two spheres. My faith is what informs and challenges my politics, and then my politics informs and challenges my faith. There's a conversation between both of those things. Seminary and my home church is where I, along with my fellow congregants and fellow students, fellow believers, it's where we dream of what the world could be. And then when I get to the Capitol every morning, I have to work on, what the world can be. And there's a difference between could and can, right? I very much here at the Capitol am seeing the world from the weeds. What's immediately possible given the political constraints? How can I move the ball, 5 yards at a time to make a change in people's lives? But seminary and church is where I can see the world from the mountaintop and dream of something that's beyond current political constraints. And those two things are necessary because it's really hard to get lost in the weeds. It's also easy to get lost on the mountaintop. And I know people who get lost in both of those two spheres, and so doing both of these things is a way for me to balance out those two visions, and be able to change my community and my state and my country for the better. But in a very tangible, practical sense, I just got back from. I'm speaking to you from the state capitol, from my office in the bottom of the basement. I'm a young member, and so I don't have much seniority. So I'm literally 3 stories underground as I speak to you right now. But I just came from class about half an hour ago. I'm taking a January term course about love in the Hebrew Bible, and the ways in which God expresses God's love for us, and we express our love for God in community, in that covenant. And to me, that's a perfect expression of what democracy is in 21st century America, right? Democracy is not a constitution; it's a covenant. It's a way of it's a relationship between neighbors. And the scary part is that we have some of our neighbors who are violating that covenant that we have with one another, God, right? With every stormed capital step, with every violation of our Constitution, we are weakening those bonds between ourselves and our neighbors. And so I find inspiration, especially in the Hebrew text, of how we sustain that covenant, that bond, that love between neighbors through struggle and strife, and that takes on a real meaning when you come to a place like the Texas Capitol.
Gosh, there's so much just depth and richness, and you made me even think about democracy in a new way. I honestly don't think I've thought about democracy as a covenant before, so just thank you for that. But it is an unusual choice, right, for a politician to go to seminary, like to go after a seminary degree instead of an MBA or a law degree. I'd love to know, yeah, just how you think about, just to go further into the value that the seminary education, why you've gone for that. I mean, I know it's personal because you've talked about your sense of call, but yeah, just what the value for other people in other professions, thinking about the value of a seminary education.
Yeah, such a good question. Political campaign consultants don't usually advise their clients to become Presbyterian ministers. That's not the typical path forward for a politician. But honestly, I grew up in a very politically active church, and I don't mean that in a partisan sense. I mean that in in a in terms of activism, right? That my pastor, Dr. Jim Rigby, when I was growing up, always taught us that our faith has to move us from the sanctuary to the streets. That our love for God and for neighbor has to grow into justice. which is just love out in public. And so, my first political protest that I ever went to was when I was in fourth grade, and it was with my church. It was with my fellow congregants. It was outside the governor's mansion. George W. Bush was the governor of Texas at the time, and it was a protest calling for hate crimes legislation. This was in the wake of the murder of Matthew Shepard and James Byrd, and we were calling on the governor to enact legislation that would prevent and respond to these types of hate motivated crimes. And then I went to protest against the Iraq War. I went to protest for women's rights and reproductive rights, all with my fellow church members. So my faith was always pointing me toward politics, toward activism, toward service. But after 5 years now of doing policymaking and doing politics professionally here at the Texas Capitol, my politics has started to point me back toward faith. I've really come to believe that so many of our problems, political problems, social problems, ecological problems, um, are, are rooted in a spiritual crisis, an inability to love ourselves, love our neighbors, love our planet. And so I wanted to learn more about this spiritual crisis and wanted to learn how we could respond to it. Y'all know better than I do that so many of our spiritual institutions are deeply broken at this point in time. And so I wanted to learn more about that problem and be part of the solution. I, I really entered seminary with a lot more questions than answers, which is probably how it should be. Uh, but I had this sense, being in the lion's den here in the Capitol, that really all of it came back to a deeply rooted spiritual crisis that we're facing in our world. And I wanted to know more about that, and I couldn't learn about that going to law school or getting an MBA. Really, it's our faith traditions that I think have so much to tell us in this moment of spiritual crisis.
Yeah. I so appreciate your saying that because I believe, as you have said, and it really guides our work, that this is a season in which people and communities in our world needs the voice of the church. That it is time for the church to stand tall and strong, to speak a word of love and grace and mercy and justice and hope and joy into the world. Not a time for us to be timid. And so I so appreciate that you are leaning in both on the political side and on the faith side. And in this season, we've been asking our guests to speak to um, kind of what is an accurate picture of current reality. Like what are some of the realities that we're dealing with? And one of the things that keeps coming up is the reality of polarization in our country, in our culture, and even in our churches, right? And so I think you live in the midst of this. You have just described it. We know it to be true in politics, of course. And so I'm curious about your take on polarization in our country, what you're seeing, what you're learning and observing.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And polarization, division, tribalism to me feels like the challenge of our time. And I see it every day here in the state capitol, and feel the pull and the tug of polarization to keep us divided. My sense is that you know there are um, there are folks at the top, economically, politically, who are invested in keeping us divided from one another, invested in keeping us from recognizing that we have far more in common than we do difference. And so I think our challenges as Christians, as believers, as people of faith, um, as Texans and as Americans, is to resist those efforts to pull us apart. Um, you know, so many of these culture war fights are are less about solving problems or helping one another, and they're much more about driving a wedge between neighbors, between communities. And so when I talked earlier about love for neighbor, that for me is put into practice here on the floor of the Texas House. I try to see the humanity, the divine image in those with whom I have major disagreements. I'm a member of the Democratic Party, for full disclosure. And I operate in a Republican controlled legislature. So to get anything done here, I have to work with people who I have profound disagreements with, and that has to be built on genuine love and trust and respect, which is getting harder and harder to establish with one another given those divisions. But seminary has honestly helped me do that, and has helped me. Once the reason I think that Jesus gave that second commandment, which he said was like the first, is because once you recognize that divine image in yourself, you can't help but recognize it in other people. The parable of the Good Samaritan specifically defines neighbor as someone who's different from us, right? Racially, ethnically, religiously, politically, and that's the challenge of the gospel, right? Not to love those who look like us, those who believe like us, those who think like us. And I just, to sum up, I think it's getting harder to hear that call, but it's more necessary than ever in 2024.
James, you've said previously that loving your neighbor is exhausting, especially in a place like the Texas legislature, right? And I wonder how do you sustain that stance of love? Like, where are you finding hope and encouragement from the people that you've struggled to love? Like, are you seeing them come towards you as much as you go towards them? And yeah, what would you say to others as they just try to maintain this sense of loving others in a really hard time?
Yeah. Well, and let's take it out of politics for a second, because I'm sure there are folks listening to your podcast that don't consider themselves political or partisan, or maybe turned off by politics. It's difficult to love your neighbor or love anyone because these forms of ours pass away, right? This is something where I feel like Hinduism and Buddhism have a lot to teach Christians about impermanence, about change, and about our radical interconnections. So love is always, any kind of serious love is going to lead to suffering. I think that's the symbol of the cross. And that's true in our own lives, right? When you love someone, my grandmother is suffering from Alzheimer's, and she's one who means more to me than anyone. And her form is passing away, as mine will one day, as all of ours will one day. And so I think again that the reason that the first commandment is to love God before loving neighbor is it's a call to see the kind of divine light that shines from each person, right? And to fall in love with that rather than falling in love with these passing forms, because that will always break our hearts. And so now, if we take that into a political context, how can you see past the forms, past the temporary kind of rhetoric and beliefs and affiliations, and see the divine light shining from each person, right? Many times in my political party, I'm criticized for working with Republicans, and it's seen as a zero sum choice between being a good progressive and working across the aisle. But for me, as a progressive, as a Democrat, the reason I believe that every person is entitled to health care, the reason I believe everyone is entitled to equal rights under the law, is because I believe that every person has infinite worth and value. And that applies to my Republican colleagues, right? It applies to the insurrectionists at January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. it applies to those who are committing war crimes around the world. That is the unsettling part of the gospel message, is how to love those who are unlovable, right? And so I do that every day here. I there are times, I'm a proud pro-choice Christian, and I know there are listeners to your podcast who may have a different position on that difficult topic, but that's where my faith leads me, is to a position to support abortion rights. And so here in the Texas Capitol, we had a vote where the majority ripped those rights away from every single one of my neighbors with a uterus in the state of Texas. That was a deeply emotional, deeply painful day for me on the floor of the Texas House. But the next day, I had to come back to work and find common ground on issues where I did agree with my Republican colleagues, particularly issues around public education funding and fighting some of these efforts to privatize public schools. The same legislators you know, who did what I consider morally reprehensible work on one issue are my partners on the next one. And so that's a very difficult space to navigate. And and to do that, I've had to really lean into that that recognition of divinity in my colleagues, and I'm hoping that what I'm going through on the floor of the Texas House may be helpful to those who are navigating these tensions within a church community, within a neighborhood, within their own family. I'm sure there are folks who just had Thanksgiving and Christmas with family members um, who have who have completely different political views, and so bridging those divides, finding common ground when we can, and working through these profound disagreements is necessary if we're going to maintain that covenant of democracy going into the next decade and the next century.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to change tack just a little bit, and I want to ask you about your friendship agenda.
Yeah.
Which is, maybe it's the outworking of loving your neighbor, but the last series of this podcast was all about friendship. The whole season was about holy friendships.
Yeah.
So I'd just love to know why friendship,
Yeah.
where the friendship agenda come from.
And I love that y'all focused on friendship. So much of our culture and movies and books are focused on romantic love, or focused on familial love. Obviously, two of the most um, deeply moving loves in our own lives. But not enough attention is paid to the love between friends, those who aren't related and those who are not romantically involved. And this is important to me as a Texan. You may know that we are the friendly state. That's friendship is actually our official motto as a state. And the word Texas comes from the Caddo Native American word for friend, and that word had deep political connotations. It didn't mean friend, as someone that you share interests with, or someone you live close to. It actually meant someone in a different tribe, someone in a different community. Maybe a better word is ally. And that's the meaning of that particular word. And so when you now think about what the word Texas means, or what our motto of friendship means, it means having solidarity with folks who are different from you. And that to me is going to be the ball game in the coming years if we're going to save American democracy. Is how do we maintain solidarity with one another even when we're different? How do we build um, friendship across lines of difference? And so suddenly friendship goes from kind of the hanging out with your friends on a Saturday night to now having a profound political meaning. And so I've tried to draw on that history of Texas being the friendly state, of valuing friendship, and bring that into our modern political conversations. What part of what makes Texas great? I don't know how much time y'all be able to spend in our state, but what makes Texas wonderful is that we are this mashup of all different cultures and food and music. Everything about our state is this. It's America on steroids. It's the melting pot of melting pots, right? And that friendship is what sustains that. It's what makes Texas great. And those who are trying to divide us, those who are trying to demonize other people who are different, don't understand Texas. They don't understand what makes us great, and by extension, don't understand America and what makes America great. And so that's where friendship comes from for me, and why I think it informs my agenda here at the state capitol.
I see how closely that ties to your faith and what you were saying before about this notion of love God, love neighbor is, and that loving neighbor really is about this friendship that you're describing, that is not about um, well, in addition to your best friend that you grew up with and you've loved all your life and hang out on a Saturday night, but it's even beyond that. It's even deeper than that, and it crosses boundaries, it crosses borders. It helps us to cross aisles, whatever the image you want to use that says, how do we move into our lives and our world in a healing way, and that friendship is at the heart and core of this. And
Well, and
beautiful.
Jesus told us that that is the greatest love, to
Mhm.
lay down one's life for your friend.
Yeah.
It's kind of it sounds strange at first. It's such a strange way to phrase it. And he says he no longer calls us student; he calls us a friend.
Friend.
So friendship, and I love that you use the imagery of crossing lines of difference or boundaries, and that's often the story in the gospel is Jesus and his followers crossing these boundaries that
Mhm.
seemed insurmountable, but turn out to be very permeable. uh,
Mhm.
so yeah, that to me is what friendship in this sense is all about.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to bring us into a conversation that, has the potential to be hard, but we've already been to hard places. And I think part of what you're doing is you're, this commute that you're making between church and state daily, um, and in your life. I just what I'd like to do is lean into a place where faith and politics finds itself sometimes merged and mashed in significant ways in our country right now, and that's this notion of Christian nationalism. And one of our friends and thought leaders that we rely on quite a bit, Dr. Gil Rendell, has helped us understand with some real depth the growing danger of Christian nationalism in our country, and as people of faith, what it means to show up from a place of deep conviction and faith in political spheres, and where the edges are of that versus Christian nationalism. And so you, as a person of deep faith, bring this, I think, unique and important voice, um, and in this. And so I'd love, I'm inviting you to speak into um, where you are offering wisdom and thought around religious pluralism, Christian nationalism. Can you talk a little bit about what your message is there?
Yeah, I've so much of the work that I've done here at the state capitol is confronting um, and confronting and combating Christian nationalism. There was a bill to mandate that the Ten Commandments be posted in every classroom. There was a bill to replace guidance counselors in schools with untrained, unsupervised religious chaplains. There was a bill to privatize public schools, take money out of those schools to give to private Christian schools. Nothing against private Christian schools, but we have limited tax dollars here, and my belief is that they should go to funding schools that serve everybody, and those are our neighborhood public schools. So, in a very real, tangible sense, Christian nationalism is on the rise here in Texas. And nationally, that's also the case.
Mhm.
2 years ago, we saw Christian nationalists storm the U.S. Capitol, um, hurting police officers while carrying crosses and signs reading "Jesus saves." Um, a year ago, we had Christian nationalists on the U.S. Supreme Court overturn Roe versus Wade, allowing states like Texas to outlaw abortion, even in cases of rape and incest. Um, and as I mentioned, you're seeing Christian nationalists trying to dismantle the institution of public education in states like Texas. So this is very real, and something that we as Christians must confront and resist at every turn. And I think as believers, we have to come to terms with the fact that this is a cancer on our religion. And until we confess the sin that is Christian nationalism and exorcise it from our churches, our religion is going to do a lot more harm than good in the coming years in the United States and across the world. Um, I believe there is nothing Christian about Christian nationalism. Um, Jesus started a universal movement based on mutual love. Christian nationalism is a sectarian movement based on universal hatred. Jesus includes, Christian nationalism excludes. Uh, Jesus liberates, Christian nationalism controls. Uh, Jesus saves, and Christian nationalism kills. He told us we would know them by their fruits,
Mm.
and those fruits have become painfully obvious to Americans, across the spectrum. Um, and so, I think it's important for us to understand where this is coming from, and that it's not a new phenomenon, right? We are seeing it rear its ugly head, but this is something as old as the church. As y'all are well aware, the first Christians didn't call themselves Christians; they called themselves the Way, right?
Mhm.
They were living out this new vision of what it meant to be human, given to them by their crucified teacher. They were a peculiar people who didn't participate in the economy, in the military, in the culture. The book of Acts tells us that those first Christians were persecuted for turning the world upside down. But 300 years after Jesus was executed by the Roman Empire, Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official state religion of that very same empire, right? So in my understanding of our church's history, Constantine was the first Christian nationalist,
Mm.
and and ever since, the powers that be have been taming, domesticating, diluting Christianity into something more palatable, pro-war, pro-wealth, pro-white supremacy. Um, and at every turn, there have been Christians who read the gospel and try to live out that original vision in opposition to the powerful forces trying to tranquilize our religion and trying to use our religion to consolidate their own power. And so that I think it's important, if we're going to resist Christian nationalism today, we have to understand where it's come from and the damage it has done to our faith for 1,500 years. And so this is not new, and it's incumbent upon us as Christians to follow the example of those first members of the early church and the brave Christians from Dorothy Day to Dr. King, who have tried to truly follow Jesus even within a corrupted Christian nationalist worldview.
Feels it's so helpful to hear you very clearly distinguish between what you understand to be the Christian faith and the gospel call, and how Christian nationalism gets played out, and that feels important to me because we can often do an either or kind of thing in our head, and good and bad and that kind of thing. So you lay that against what you've said about, which I believe, and that is this kind of generous heart of love that sees every person as a beloved child of God.
Yeah.
And so, how we approach each other is not to play into that dualism, but rather to see the cancer, if you will, and to say, um, how do we combat that?
Yeah.
And okay, so that said, I suspect it can creep in really subtle ways in our congregation, in ways we think are of faith and that are tied to the gospel, but maybe are more influenced by the culture
Mhm.
than by the gospel call. And so I wonder what steps you think faith leaders can take in their own context and in congregations to to love well,
Mhm.
but also not to buy into a sort of cultural Christian nationalism that you're describing.
Yeah, well, I think yes. Let's start by taking the log out of our own eye, and recognizing that there are no bad people, just bad ideas, and those bad ideas infect all of us to some
Mhm.
degree or another. Um, and to me, Christian nationalism is rooted in a desire for control,
Mm.
and I struggle with that desire every day in my own life too, as I'm sure you all do as well.
Yeah, Lord have
Um,
mercy.
right,
Mhm.
and the Christian nationalist ideology is one built on fear, and therefore the response to fear is an attempt to control yourself, others, and the world around you, right? Controlling what you read, controlling what you say, controlling what you do with your body, controlling where you travel. That control to me is diametrically opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is a gospel of freedom and trust and faith. Um, One of my, there are um, many verses of scripture that bring me comfort, but probably um, none bring me more comfort than when Jesus takes all of his early followers to a hilltop,
Mm.
which I've never been to the Holy Land, but from what I've read, I think it looks a lot like the Texas Hill Country. For those who've ever been to the Hill Country, it's kind of dry and rocky, but covered in wildflowers and birds, and the beauty of nature. So Jesus is taking people out of their economy, out of their culture, out of their human systems, bringing them to nature, to this hillside, and pointing out the lilies of the field
Mm.
and the birds of the air, and telling them not to worry, not to control, to trust in God, trust in love. I mean, the entire um, uh, all of the teachings and the passion and the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus all to me point to that radical trust in God, in love, in the life process. And to me, that's why Christian nationalism is such a threat to the gospel, because instead of trusting God, instead of trusting love, it's calling us to take control ourselves
Mm.
in a chaotic world, in a scary world. And that is not something that Christian nationalists with a capital C, a capital N fall victim to. It's also something we all fall victim to every single day. It's really hard to have the faith that Jesus is calling us to have, and instead, it's a lot easier to believe in your own human agency, in your own human power. And that's what I think we have to be on the lookout for in our churches. Even if you feel like, we're an inclusive church, we stand opposed to Christian nationalism. I think what's more helpful is to look inward and recognize the ways in which that Christian nationalist ideology infects all of us, regardless of where we stand on that particular spectrum.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So this feels really important James, and I appreciate the ways that you're helping our leaders, our listeners, who are primarily leaders in the church, clergy and lay, think about what this looks like in their own context. I I want to pivot a little bit, and the third piece of Jesus's commandment that he gives to us, love God, love neighbor as self, right? Is this how we care for ourselves? And I can't help but think about this very hard work that you're doing of living in to your faith and your call from God in a context that is where every single day, as you have described, you are drawn into living that out in a way where you also face resistance. And anytime we face resistance, it's a bit exhausting. It wears on us. You're in the midst of a reelection campaign. I know how public that gets, and people say things that are unkind for whatever reason. And so, how do you stay grounded, humble? I mean, you're amazing to visit with. You're just so real. And I mean, obviously, but just um, such a humble spirit. And so, how do you keep your ego and ambition in check? How do you pursue your work in the midst of resistance? How do you care for yourself? These are the kinds of things I'm wondering about.
Yeah. Well, one, I think it's important to recognize that my struggles are fairly minor compared to many
Mm,
people's struggles. I get to work every day in the air conditioning. I work in a building surrounded by armed security.
sure.
And I have plenty of perks and benefits
Mm,
that go along with my position that many people, including a lot of your listeners, who are doing equally important work don't get. So I want to acknowledge that up front. There's a tremendous amount of privilege that comes with the job that I have, even though it is difficult. But I also think it's helpful to remember that our gospel is built for tough times,
mm,
right? It was first um, delivered in difficult circumstances to oppressed people living under an oppressive empire. It has been used to inspire and ground and motivate people working through all kinds of oppression and strife and suffering, including in the United States, including very recently. And so, you know, to me, I think we have to remember that we're all working on the same project, which is to realize the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven.
nice.
That is our shared work, and and it relates to what we were just talking about earlier, because Jesus didn't come to establish a Christian nation. I have no doubt that Jesus could have established a Christian theocracy, but I don't think love would ever do that.
Mm,
Uh, I, I think the closest thing we have to the kingdom of heaven is a multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious democracy where power is shared with one another. Um, it's the kingdom of God is not like any kingdom we've ever known, right? Instead of a throne, Jesus sits at a table. Instead of a war horse, Jesus rides a donkey. Uh, Instead of a sword, Jesus picks up a cross. So this kingdom of God inverts the power dynamics of all the
yeah.
kingdoms of the world, and including professional politics.
Mm,
Right, in this kingdom, true strength is vulnerability. True status is equality. True wealth is sharing. And we're called to realize this kingdom not by force, but with faith, with that trust that we were just talking about moments earlier. And I think that's because Jesus anticipated that in a world of fear, we would all grasp at something other than God, right? We would grasp onto our own egos. We would grasp onto money, or violence, or power, political power, right? That which I think is probably the greatest idol of them all.
Right.
And the gospel is full of stories of Jesus resisting that very idol of power, of control, right? Whether it's in the wilderness when tempted by the devil with power, whether it's with his bumbling disciples who are constantly asking how they can be better than one another and have more
Mhm.
power than one another. Um, the gospel is a challenge to that traditional notion of power, and it's something that challenges me every day, and helps keep my own ego in check and my own desire for control and for power. Because I know there are good-hearted people listening to your podcast right now who I'm sure have thought, if I could just be king for a day, I could fix all this, right? I could solve all these problems if I could just have all the power. And that's something we're explicitly called not to do, something we're called to resist within ourselves. And so to me, that's the best way to stay humble, um, to stay sane, and to stay committed to the project, to the work, because we have to do both, right? There's that great Jewish saying, I'm going to butcher it, but about how you're not called to get rid of all of the world's grief, um, uh, but you're also not allowed to abandon the work, and so those two things have to be done in tandem. We both have to stay healthy and grounded and take care of ourselves while still staying committed to the shared work that we're all privileged to be engaged in.
Gosh, I really love you've got some real quotes in what you've just said, like the gospel, like our gospel was built for hard times. I just like, oh, it's so true. And oh, we can take comfort from that. And I really appreciate it. Um, anyway, I want to ask you a question about where you're finding hope. And I just want to go back. We started this season, the very first guest was Dr. Meg Wheatley, and she said change on a global scale is not where we need to be focusing. Like she doubled down on the difference we can make locally. Her language is about creating islands of sanity where we can help each other become of the best human being possible. Right?
Yeah,
How do we become our best selves?
yeah,
Um, and so when we watch what's going on in the country at a national level, it can be overwhelming.
yeah.
But I'd like to know what's the hope that you think we can lean into at the local level? And could you share some stories, maybe from your own district, of the way people are making a difference and kind of helping create
Yeah.
to create the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven in your own district? I'd love to know just, yeah, your stories of hope.
Yeah, and that's such good advice, because not only are you more effective locally, but it's much more nourishing to our soul
Mm.
because you're interacting with real flesh and blood human beings on the ground in the real world. There's technology has done a lot of good. I'm not someone who is anti technology, but we should also recognize how technology has kind of removed ourselves from our own bodies, from our own tangible reality. I don't think we, as with our little monkey brains, are meant to absorb all of the world's grief when we open up our little phones. Right? It's too much for our evolution to handle. It's too much for our finite selves to handle. But our little pocket demons, every time we open them up,
Mm.
they expose us to a world full of suffering, and that is unsustainable. And again, I think it's the incarnation, the mystery of the incarnation can help us here because um, God came into the world in a very particular circumstance, right? Born into a Jewish body from a Jewish woman in a particular circumstance on particular land, um, and so are so are we, right? All of us are in a particular community with particular people, and so we have to be committed to that, right? There's such a temptation to be universal and act universally and take on universal problems, but we as finite beings are incapable of that. We have to be engaged and committed to our particular circumstances, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly what Jesus did, and it's exactly what we should do, following in his footsteps. And so, to answer your second question about what I'm seeing, I as a former educator, I take it upon myself to visit every single school campus in my legislative district. So every elementary school, every middle school, every high school, every alternative school,
Wow.
and be able to visit with educators and with students in those schools in my community. Because although I was an educator, I don't claim to know all the struggles that teachers are going through in 2024. I was in the classroom about a decade ago. And so it's a helpful learning process for me, but it's also selfish because I am constantly inspired by the work that
Mm.
public school teachers do in my community and across the state of Texas under very difficult circumstances. Because of the ways our communities have changed because of globalization and technology and income inequality, our schools, our local neighborhood schools, are in some ways the last pillar left standing in our communities, right? There, you used to have a local business that cared about local workers. You used to have local hospitals with a local doctor who had a relationship with the patients in a community. Used to have temples and churches and synagogues and mosques. Those have, as we all are well aware, have declined over the last few decades as well. So the last pillar that's really left standing is the school, and the school has, as a result of those changes, the schools have been asked to do so much more than they used to do. It's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic now. The school is in charge of feeding kids, charge of nutrition. It's in charge of physical and mental and spiritual health. So much more than I think the designers of our education system ever intended. But those teachers with limited pay, with limited time, are accepting that challenge on behalf of our kids. And I mean, I can't tell you the number of teachers who are buying school supplies with their own money, who are staying well after the workday ends to take care of their kids. And sadly, because we have neglected to do anything about gun violence in this country, teachers who are putting their own bodies in between kids and gunmen who are trying to commit horrific mass murders on school campuses. Some of your listeners may remember the two teachers in Uvalde, Texas, who gave their lives to protect their kids. There was a principal in Iowa who sacrificed his life to protect his kids during a shooting. So when I get discouraged, when I get tired, when I'm ready to give up, when I flirt with hopelessness, I always think about the educators in my district, in my neighborhood,
Yeah.
who every day are giving of themselves for their kids, for those families, and for the next generation. And there are, in a time of Christian nationalism and mega church preachers, I think there are very few. There are, if I'm thinking of the people who truly embody Christ in our communities, I think teachers have to be at the top of that list, because they are truly doing the Lord's work every single day without fame, without recognition, without wealth, and they're an example, I think, to all of us.
Yeah. It's a powerful witness and really, as you say, a powerful uh, testimony to hope. And you were talking, and I just got chills thinking about the sacrifices and the commitment and the dedication and the witness. And thank you for making those visits. I know that that is a profound uh, manifestation of support. So thank you for the ways that you do that. So, we're asking all of our guests a final question this season. And so, as you consider the realities we've named and that you've described, and the leadership to which you've been called, what do you want to be remembered for?
I love this question. It's such a difficult question. I think I'll, there is, especially in politics, there is an obsession on how individual politicians will be remembered with legacy.
Sure.
And in some ways, I think that's a little harmful,
Mm.
and it's a centering of the ego,
Mm.
to wonder how you as an individual self, an impermanent self, are going to be remembered after you leave. And the reality is that none of us will be remembered ultimately, right? Even the greatest emperors and kings and pharaohs are eventually forgotten by history.
Mm.
And I at least take a little comfort in that, right? That no matter how great your works are, no matter what monuments you build, ultimately you'll pass away like everything else.
Yeah.
And so I guess, uh, the only one I want to remember me is God.
Mm.
And I hope, in the words of Matthew 25, when I get up to those pearly gates, I'm going to hear those words of, "Well done, good and faithful servant."
Yeah.
And to me, that kind of trust and faith in love and in life and in God is what I strive to have. I fail every day at it,
Mhm.
and will continue to fail at it. But my hope is that at the end of the day, um, my trust will win out, and will be remembered by God, and I'll be thanked for my service one last time.
Mhm. Well, by the grace of God, may it be so for you and for all of us. So, James, thank you for your time today, for your um, faithful yes every single day, and the ways that you are living out your faith. Grateful to you. Thanks.